The restaurant was the kind of place that hadn't changed in 30 years, and this was presented as its greatest virtue. High ceilings, brass fixtures the color of old money, waiters who moved with the precision of men who had been trained by their fathers. The tablecloths were white linen. The silverware was heavy enough to anchor you to your chair. I had been coming here since I was 12, always for the same reason, to watch my parents spend money they didn't have while I pretended not to notice. I arrived early, which was my habit. I wanted to be seated before they arrived, wanted the small advantage of established position. The host knew me by name and by the fact that I always paid cash or card at the end of the evening. He seated me at a table large enough for 8, though there were only 5 of us coming. My mother liked the space. It made her feel important, she had once told me, as if she was a woman who required room to spread out. My father was the first to arrive. He walked in with the kind of confidence that only comes from a lifetime of believing yourself to be the most interesting person in any room. George Reed at 61 still had the posture of a younger man, still wore his shirts unbuttoned at the collar as if to announce that he had no need for the formality the rest of us required. He kissed me on the cheek, a gesture that felt obligatory, and sat across from me rather than beside me. I had learned not to interpret these small choices. They meant nothing and everything simultaneously. My mother came next, and with her came the temperature change that always happened in her presence. Margaret Reed had perfected the art of entrance. She wore navy, which had always been her color, and her jewelry was understated in the way that only expensive jewelry can be. She held my face in her hands when she greeted me, the kind of physical contact that was performed for the benefit of the waiter hovering near our table. "Darling," she said. "You look tired." Olivia arrived in a cloud of energy and perfume, still glowing from her engagement. She was 26 and beautiful in an uncomplicated way that had never required effort from her. She was also, by the unspoken family consensus, the successful one. Not because she had accomplished anything in particular, but because she had done what she was supposed to do, which was to attract a wealthy man who had the right name and the right family. Her fiancé, Jeremy, was not present. Olivia had mentioned that he was in Palm Beach on business, a phrase that seemed to mean whatever was most convenient at any given moment. My brother Daniel was not there. He had sent his regrets via email 3 days earlier, claiming a work conflict that I suspected was not entirely true. Daniel had perfected the art of absence. He had moved to Boston 7 years ago and had gradually excused himself from these dinners with the kind of consistency that eventually becomes policy. My mother sometimes remarked, with a tightness in her voice, that Daniel had always been a difficult. What she meant was that he had refused to play. We ordered wine. My father ordered an expensive bottle that he did not intend to pay for, so he gestured expansively while discussing its provenance, as if the generosity of ordering it was somehow his contribution. I watched him conduct this small theatre while the waiter nodded and disappeared. The conversation began with the usual landmarks. My mother asked about work, but not in a way that suggested she wanted to know about my work. She wanted to know if I was stressed, if I was sleeping well, if I was managing. These were code words for "Are you stable enough to handle what we need from you?" My father interjected with a story about a golf game he had played with someone whose name I didn't recognize, but who my mother assured me was terribly important. Olivia talked about the wedding, which was now only 4 months away. The numbers attached to everything, the photographer, the venue, the dress, were staggering. My mother listened with the kind of rapt attention that suggested she was imagining herself in the photographs. The food arrived. It was excellent. Which was to say it was expensive and therefore good, because in my family's estimation these things were the same. I ate slowly, already aware of what was coming. There was a rhythm to these dinners that I had learned to read the way a sailor reads weather. The wine was poured. My father's mood became more expansive. My mother's posture straightened. Olivia's phone came out briefly, a gesture of barely contained excitement that suggested she was about to announce something. It was my father who made the first explicit request. He leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man about to ask for something he had already decided was his. "Lauren," he said, "your mother and I have been thinking about the house." I set down my fork. I had learned to do this during difficult conversations. It was a way of signaling that I was present, that I was listening, but also that I was not entirely available. The house was the house in Westchester, the one I had been paying the mortgage on for the past 5 years. It was a question that contained the weight of my entire childhood. "The roof," and my mother continued, her voice taking on the particular tone she used when discussing expenses, which was a tone of injured disappointment, as if the universe had conspired to make things difficult for her personally. "We've had the contractors in. It needs replacing. It's quite bad, actually. They said it's a miracle we didn't have water damage in the last storm." My father nodded, accepting the baton. "We're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of $60,000. Maybe more, once they get under there and see what the real damage is." I said nothing. I had learned that silence was sometimes the most effective form of communication. The waiter appeared to refill our wine glasses, and I watched my parents' faces reorganize themselves into expressions of casual repose while he worked. Once he was gone, my mother leaned forward slightly. "We thought perhaps you might be able to help," she said. The word help carried the weight of obligation disguised as request. "Just for this. We know it's asking a lot, but the house is important to the family. It's your history, Lauren. Our history." "I can't," I said. The words came out evenly, without the tremor of anxiety that would have accompanied them even a year earlier. "I'm trying to build my own savings. I need to think about my own future." The shift was immediate. I watched it cross my father's face like a shadow passing over water. My mother's hand paused halfway to her wine glass. Olivia's eyes widened with the particular alarm of someone who has never heard me refuse before. "That's remarkably selfish," my father said. His voice was still pleasant, but there was an edge underneath it now, the kind of edge that had appeared in conversations throughout my childhood when someone had failed to meet his expectations. "Your mother's health is not what it was. The stress of worrying about this house." "The roof isn't an emergency," I said. "It can wait. There are contractors who offer payment plans." My mother made a small noise. It was the kind of noise she had perfected over decades, a noise that combined hurt, betrayal, and the suggestion that I had just stabbed her directly in the heart. "I see," she said quietly. "So when your mother needs you, you simply refuse." I looked at her. She was a woman of 59 who had not worked in more than 20 years. She played tennis twice a week. She had lunch with friends who had similar lives. She was not sick. I had her medical records because I had helped her organize them during a doctor's visit years ago, and I checked them regularly out of a habit of worry that I was beginning to understand was not entirely my own. "That's not fair," I said. My father laughed. It was a loud laugh, the kind meant to draw attention from nearby tables. Several people glanced over. "Not fair," he repeated, as if the words were absurd in his mouth. "You know what's not fair? Supporting two people who built your entire world, who sacrificed everything so that you could have advantages, and then having you sit there and tell us you won't help with a simple roof." "You haven't sacrificed anything," I said. My voice was quiet, but I could feel something shifting inside me. It was not anger exactly. It was clarity. "You've been retired for 20 years. I've paid your mortgage for 5. The temperature at the table changed. My mother set down her fork very carefully. Olivia was looking between my parents and me with the expression of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. My father's face was darkening slightly, a physiological response I had learned to recognize as dangerous. You understand, he said, his voice quieter now, which was worse somehow than the loud laugh, that your mother and I built you. We gave you everything. Every advantage you have, we paid for. Your education, your entire life until you were old enough to go to college. And now you want to sit here and tell us that supporting yourself is more important than helping your own parents when they need you? I have been helping, I said. For 5 years. A mortgage payment, my mother said softly, is hardly support. That's maintaining a property. That's not support. Support is what we gave you. Support is sacrifice. I watched my father push his chair back from the table. Several other diners looked over. There was a moment where I thought he might leave, and then a moment where I realized he was simply repositioning himself, making himself larger in the space he occupied. You were always the practical one, he said. The responsible one. The one we could count on. But I'm beginning to understand that what we actually raised was someone cold. Someone selfish. Someone who, when her parents ask for help in an emergency. There is no emergency, I said. He did not look at me when he spoke next. I wonder what it must be like to raise a daughter who responds to love with indifference. I wonder what I did wrong. The question hung in the air. It was designed to land in a specific place in my chest, a place that had been sensitized by years of similar questions, years of implied blame, years of being positioned as the person responsible for her parents' emotional weather. I watched it work its way into my mother's expression, watched her shoulders tighten with the weight of having raised an ungrateful daughter. Olivia was staring at her plate. There was a waiter moving toward our table, and I was aware that the scene we were creating was beginning to breach some invisible boundary of propriety. I was also aware that my father wanted the waiter to continue approaching, wanted there to be witnesses. That was part of the calculation. There was nothing my father enjoyed more than being the wronged party in front of an audience. I set my napkin on the table. I stood up. My father looked at me with the expression of a man who had just won something, who had goaded me into exactly the reaction he wanted. I'm not going to do this, I said. I said it quietly, but clearly. I'm not going to sit here and be manipulated about a roof that is not an emergency. I'm not going to feel guilty about wanting to have my own life. And I'm going to cut off the mortgage payments, effective immediately. My mother made a sound that might have been a gasp. Lauren. I'll pay for my meal and I'll leave, I continued. I was aware that my hands were steady, which surprised me. I was aware that I was breathing normally. I was aware that something had shifted in the architecture of my life, and that this shift was irreversible. But I won't be paying for the roof. I won't be paying for emergencies that aren't emergencies. And I won't come back to these dinners until the expectation changes. My father's face was very red now. You walk out that door, he said, his voice rising. Ian, you need to understand that you're walking out on this family. You're walking out on us. Do you understand what it will mean if something happens to your mother and you were not there? I understand, I said. It was the truth. I did understand. I understood perfectly. I put $200 cash on the table, which was far more than my portion of the meal, and I left. I did not hug anyone goodbye. I did not apologize. I did not glance back. I walked through the restaurant toward the exit. And I felt the weight of eyes on me, the eyes of people who had witnessed the dissolution of something they recognized from their own lives. Outside, the evening was cool. It was late September, and the city had that particular quality it had in fall when the lights started to change and you could feel the season shifting. The street was busy with people moving in different directions, each one following their own logic. I walked toward the subway without any clear plan other than to get home, to sit in my apartment, to understand what had just happened. By the time I reached my building, my phone had begun its symphony. 13 missed calls from my mother's number. 8 from my father's. 3 from Olivia. Text messages that progressed from hurt to furious to pleading. You've made a terrible mistake. Call us immediately. Your mother is extremely upset. Do you understand what you've done to her? Please. Can we talk about this calmly tomorrow? We were out of line. Partly. If anything happens to her, it's on you. I turned off my phone. I sat in the darkness of my apartment with all the lights off and felt something that might have been fear or might have been relief. It occurred to me that I had no way to distinguish between them. It occurred to me that for the past 5 years, for the past 15 years, for possibly my entire life, my capacity to distinguish between fear and relief had been so thoroughly colonized by obligation that they had become indistinguishable. That was how they worked, people like my parents. They made the distinction impossible. They made you feel afraid of relief and relieved by fear, and then they made you feel guilty for feeling anything at all. The next morning, I called my financial advisor. Michael Lawson had been managing my investments for 4 years. He was a man in his late 60s who had the particular quality of someone who had seen enough financial ruin to understand the fragility of everything. I had scheduled a meeting with him for that afternoon, and I walked into his office with a question that I had not known was urgent until I had to speak it aloud. I want a complete review of my finances for the past 5 years, I said. I sat across from him in a chair that was positioned to give me a view of the city beyond the windows. I want to know every transaction, every account, every card. Michael did not ask me to explain. He had seen this moment before. He opened a file on his computer and began to move through my financial life with the methodical precision of someone examining a crime scene. It took 3 hours. I watched his face as the picture emerged. I watched the small tightening at the corners of his mouth that happened when he found something that required particular attention. There were 5 credit cards that I did not remember opening. There was a personal loan in my name for $30,000. There was documentation showing that all the statements had been routed to my parents' address in Westchester. I had never seen a single statement for any of these accounts. How much total? I asked. Michael did the math. He wrote the number on a piece of paper and turned it toward me. I looked at it. It was a number that represented 5 years of my salary directed somewhere other than my own future. It was $473,000. That was the fraud. That was the amount that my parents had extracted from my financial life in ways that ranged from direct requests to outright theft. This is identity theft, Michael said quietly. At minimum. Possibly securities fraud. Definitely wire fraud if any of these transfers crossed state lines. He paused. Are your parents' signatories on any of your accounts? I thought about this. I thought about the conversations where I had been asked to add them to accounts for emergencies. I thought about the times I had refused and then eventually acquiesced, sometimes years later when the request had been rephrased or when my own resistance had eroded through repetition. I thought about the mortgage, which they had requested I take over it temporarily when I was 24 and fresh out of graduate school with my first real job. That had been 5 years ago. Temporary was a word I should have learned to be suspicious of. Yes, I said. Michael picked up his phone. He had a particular expression on his face, the expression of a man who had moved beyond the realm of financial planning into the realm of crisis management. I'm going to recommend an attorney, he said. Not someone from the firm. Someone who specializes in financial crimes. You're going to need specific legal counsel. By the next morning, I had a meeting with Elliot Parker. His office was in a different part of the city, in a building that was newer and less prestigious than Michael's. Parker himself was younger than I expected, maybe late 40s, and he had the particular quality of someone who had built a reputation on precision rather than charm. He listened while I laid out the situation. He listened while I explained the mortgage arrangement, the credit cards, the loan, the years of e-help that had been framed as family obligation. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're not naive. I need you to understand that. You're not weak. And you're not the first person I've worked with in this situation. This is called coercive control. It happens in families. It happens in intimate relationships. It happens in workplaces. The methodology is remarkably consistent. You're positioned as responsible. You're praised for your reliability. And then gradually, that reliability becomes an obligation, and the obligation becomes a trap. Does that match your experience?" I nodded. I could feel something loosening in my chest, some tension that I had been carrying for so long that I had stopped noticing it. "Here's what we're going to do," Elliot said. He opened a drawer in his desk and removed a document. "I'm going to file a report with the police. I'm going to have you sit for a forensic interview. And then I'm going to send your parents a very specific letter." The letter he drafted was remarkable in its precision. It listed every account, every transfer, every fraudulent card opening. It explained the legal ramifications. It offered a single path forward, full restitution, paid into an escrow account the Parker's firm would manage. The alternative was prosecution for wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse. This was technically inaccurate, since my parents were not elders, but the financial abuse statutes were broad enough to cover what they had done. I read the letter 3 times. Each time, I looked for evidence of something that would break my resolve. Some indication that this was too harsh, that I was overreacting, that there was some part of this that I had misunderstood. But the letter was factual. It was measured. It was exactly proportionate to what had happened. "We're going to arrange a meeting," Elliot told me. "In person. They're going to need to understand that this is real. That you're not bluffing. That the consequences are actual." The meeting took place on a Wednesday morning in a conference room in Elliot's office. I arrived early. I sat at a long table with Parker beside me. There were folders in front of us, each one labeled with dates and account numbers. There was a laptop with a spreadsheet showing the forensic accounting. There was a police report, printed and official. When my parents arrived, they came with a posture of people who expected to negotiate. My father was wearing a suit. My mother had dressed carefully. They seemed to believe that this was a business meeting, that there was a normal outcome waiting for them on the other side of civility. Elliot explained the situation with the detachment of a man discussing weather. He showed them the accounts. He walked them through the fraudulent loans. He documented the years of transfers. He explained the legal exposure. My mother's face became very pale. My father's face became very red. "This is absurd," and my father said. He stood up. "We are your parents. We built you. You don't get to sit in a lawyer's office and treat us like criminals." "Sit down," Elliot said. It was not unkind. It was simply a command, delivered with the authority of someone who had delivered similar commands many times before. My father sat down. "What you are facing," Elliot continued, "is federal fraud charges. Wire fraud carries a maximum sentence of 20 years. The identity theft charges add additional exposure. The civil liability is approximately $470,000. You have one option that avoids prosecution: full restitution, paid to an escrow account within 30 days. "We don't have that kind of money," and my mother said. It was true. I knew it was true. The money they had extracted from my life had been spent immediately, deployed in the maintenance of an illusion of affluence that had become increasingly difficult to sustain. "Then you'll need to sell the house," E. Eliot said. He slid a piece of paper across the table. "That will generate approximately sufficient funds. The mortgage, which your daughter has been paying, can be assumed by the new owners as a condition of sale. Your daughter will sign no new obligations. The funds from the sale, minus the mortgage assumption, will be transferred to escrow. Once escrow confirms receipt, the police report is withdrawn. If you do not comply, prosecution proceeds immediately." I watched my parents process this. I watched the understanding settle over them like a physical thing. The life they had built, the endless afternoons at the club, the dinners at restaurants they could not afford, the clothes that were maintained through my labor, the appearance of affluence that had been purchased with my future, all of it was gone. It had been gone the moment they opened the first fraudulent account. It was just becoming real for them now. "You would do this to us?" My mother asked. She was looking at me. "To your own parents?" "You did it first," I said. My voice was level. I was aware that this was the most important thing I had said in a very long time. "You did it without my knowledge. You did it without my consent. You did it and lied about it, and made me responsible for it. I'm not doing anything to you. I'm protecting myself." My father did not speak. He was staring at the documents on the table as if they were written in a language he was just beginning to understand. My mother was crying quietly, the kind of crying that was half genuine and half performed, and I realized that I could no longer distinguish between the two in her, that the performance had become so integrated into her actual emotional life that there was no original underneath. They sold the house 3 weeks later. The sale went smoothly. The new owners were a family with 2 children and a mortgage they could actually afford. The escrow was completed. The police report was withdrawn, which was a mercy I had not fully anticipated I would feel capable of extending. My parents moved to a rental in Connecticut, a place that was clean and modest and built for people with limited financial resources. I did not see them during the move. I did not call. I did not respond to the messages that came initially in anger and later in something that resembled remorse but was probably just exhaustion. Instead, I sat in my own apartment and allowed myself to understand what had just happened. I had severed a connection that had defined the entire architecture of my adult life. I had refused to be the thing I had been constructed to be. And the consequence was that my parents were now living a life that was proportionate to their actual resources, which meant they were living a life that was much smaller than the one they had expected. Olivia called about a month later. She was crying, and this time the tears seemed genuine, though I was learning that my assessment of other people's authenticity was not particularly reliable. "Mom is very depressed," she said. "She doesn't leave the house much. Dad has been looking for work, but nobody wants to hire him because he's been out of the workforce for so long." "I'm sorry," I said. And I was, in a way that was complicated and not uncomplicated, a way that included the recognition that what I was sorry about was not their suffering but the fact that their suffering was now impossible to avoid or escape. "I don't understand why you had to do this," Olivia said. "They're our parents. You could have just helped them. You could have let them stay in the house." I thought about how to explain to my sister that the choice was not between helping and not helping. The choice was between continuing to be the person my parents had designed me to be and becoming the person I actually was. These were not compatible. You could not do both. At some point, you had to choose. I needed to stop, I said. I needed to stop providing the fiction that they could maintain. And I needed to stop paying the price for their refusal to face reality. After we hung up, I sat with that word, fiction. All of my life, My entire existence had been structured around maintaining a fiction. The fiction that my parents were people who deserved support they did not earn. The fiction that my responsibility was infinite and unquestioned. The fiction that loving them meant accepting a permanent subordination of my own needs. The fiction that this was normal, that this was how families worked, that this was the price you paid for being the responsible one. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. I rebuilt my credit, which had been damaged by the fraudulent accounts that had taken years to clear from my file. I refinanced my student loans at a lower rate. I stopped living as if my money belonged to someone else. I purchased an apartment, a small place in a neighborhood that was not fashionable but was mine. There was a particular moment when I stood in the empty rooms and understood that nothing here was required by anyone. Nothing was owed. Nothing was obligatory. The space was mine in a way that no space in my life had ever been mine. My brother called during this period. It was the first substantive conversation we had had in more than a year. I heard what happened, he said. I wanted you to know that I think you did the right thing. How did you hear? I asked. Olivia. And Mom called me once, but I didn't answer. I think she was going to ask me for money. He paused. I'm proud of you. I want to be clear about that. After we hung up, I sat with that word, proud. I had spent so long being responsible that I had never quite understood what it felt like to be proud of myself. The feeling was strange. It was not quite joy. It was something more like the relief of setting down a weight you had been carrying so long that you had forgotten what it felt like to move without it. By the time winter came, Olivia and I had begun a kind of cautious reconstruction of relationship. She came to the city for an afternoon, and we met at a cafe that was neutral territory. She was engaged still, but the wedding had been scaled back. She was working now at a small non-profit, something her fiancé had initially opposed but had come to accept. She was becoming, I thought, a person in her own right rather than simply a reflection of her role in the family narrative. I'm sorry, she said over coffee. For the way I responded initially. For expecting you to keep everything the way it was. You were defending the world you thought you lived in, I said. I understand that. The thing is, as she continued, I didn't realize until you left that I was living in the same trap. I just had a different role. I was the one who was supposed to be beautiful and successful, and you were the one who was supposed to be responsible. And neither of those things was actually true about us. We were just people, and they put us in boxes and told us that we couldn't get out. We sat with that for a while. It was a conversation that would have been impossible before. It was possible now because I had refused to be the thing they needed me to be, and that refusal had opened a small space where other things could exist. My parents did not reach out again. I sent them a formal letter through my attorney every 6 months with an account of the mortgage being paid, the escrow concluded, the matter resolved. In December, I heard through Olivia that they had moved again, to a smaller place, that my father was working part-time at a club as a golf instructor, that my mother had taken a job as an office manager at a dentist's office. The lives they were living were not lives they had wanted. But they were lives they were capable of sustaining without my assistance. And that, I understood, was the most important thing. They were now responsible for their own existence, and the relief in that, my relief, was something I allowed myself to feel without guilt. Spring came to the city. It came the way it always came, gradually and then all at once. My apartment had good light in the afternoon, and I found myself sitting at a table I had chosen, looking at documents that represented my future rather than someone else's past. There were investment statements, and mortgage documents, and insurance policies, all of them things I had selected, things that were built on my terms rather than imposed on me. There was an email from my brother confirming plans for dinner in Boston in the summer. There was a notification that I had been promoted at work, a position I had been pursuing for years but had not had the emotional space to fully commit to until recently. The story of my family was not finished. It would never be finished. Olivia and I would continue to negotiate what our relationship meant without the weight of parental expectation. My brother and I would continue to rebuild the connection that the family structure had largely destroyed. My parents would continue to live their lives, smaller than they wanted, more real than they had ever allowed themselves to be. But I was no longer the person who paid for their fiction. I was no longer the person who carried the weight of their choices. I was no longer the person whose life was an extension of theirs. What I was instead was someone who understood that the greatest responsibility you could take on was not to your family's expectations, but to your own integrity. It was a responsibility that was quiet and unglamorous and required no performance. It was simply the practice, every day, of saying no to things that diminished you and yes to things that built you. It was the practice of understanding that freedom was not something that happened to you. It was something you chose, again and again, until the choosing became the only way you knew how to live.